I've been working in the region for many decades, and I guess I'm reflecting back on some of that experience and what I present to you today. But primarily what I'm going to be doing is reflecting on the work that we've done over the last sort of 10 years, I guess, around what we call the Pacific Tourism Data Initiative. And in the last 6 years, or so, or 5 or 6 years, MFAT has been very much involved in funding a lot of this work. And obviously, a number of other organisations, as you can see from the map there, have had some engagement as well. In each of these places, we're involved in conducting research that helps to better understand the tourism industry and its impacts. We're trying to create a decision support system that can help destinations plan and manage tourism more effectively as they move forward. The work began during a period of considerable growth in the Pacific and is now obviously, in terms of tourism, and has now transferred into a time when there is no tourism. So it's got some very important roles to play, both in understanding the past and what that can tell us about the future, but also in helping us really begin to think about the nature and the type of tourism that may come in the future as well. And the work we do focuses on visitors, on the business sector, and also on community. But it's also designed to support a range of other important research that I won't be touching on today, relating to ecosystem, environmental management, broader economic development, etc. I will be talking about some of the information that's been derived from the Pacific Tourism Data Initiative. If you're interested in any of that, you're very welcome to come to this website, and you'll see there all the reporting and all of the information that's freely available. So first of all, what I really want to do is just give us a little bit of context, and that context is really about what was happening to Pacific tourism prior to the onset of COVID and borders being closed. And I think it's fair to say that for the decade prior to 2020, we'd seen overall a period of growth. For some, that growth had been quite rapid and sustained. For others, it was uneven, perhaps because of the impact of cyclones or other factors. But the general trend was certainly one which was mirrored globally, of tourism growing. Because of that growth, Pacific Island country economies that were already dependent on tourism became increasingly dependent. And tourism everywhere in the region is an important source of income, jobs, and also economic linkages to sectors like agriculture and fisheries. We also, I think, over that decade, were seeing some of the stresses and strains that come from prolonged tourism growth. Impacts on ecosystems and environment, concerns over community acceptance of the industry and community well-being, and also the emergence of what we might call tourism hotspots, or areas where we could see some of the tensions of over-tourism starting to emerge. And this is just a slide from a few years ago, which I just pulled out because it was kind of at the heyday of this period of growth, if you like. And it just highlights too the differences we do see around the region. We've got some very large industries, some small industries. We've also got economies that are highly dependent on tourism, others that are less dependent. And this is just another measure, I guess, that we can look at, the ratio of local people in red to the number of tourists that come every year to that particular destination. And you can see here again that in some areas like Papua New Guinea, tourism's role is relatively limited, whereas in a place like the Cook Islands, the number of visitors per year far exceeds, obviously, the resident population. So we've got a diverse region that we're talking about, but tourism is playing a role wherever we look, sometimes more significant than others. And of course, with the coming of COVID and the closure of borders, international tourism has really been facing what some have called an existential crisis. A lot of discussion initially about whether tourism would survive. I think everyone knew that it would, but we still don't know what it's going to build back to, what it's going to look like. Certainly, we know that there's been a dramatic impact on the industry. Global travel flows have slowed. although they are starting to open up again, and especially in areas such as Europe and North America. We've seen more than 50 global airlines go bankrupt since March 2020, and certainly the airlines in the Pacific region are facing their own struggles. We've seen Pacific Island country international visitor numbers plummet, as they have plummeted elsewhere around the world. And all Pacific Island countries have been impacted by these shifts in one way or another. A country like Solomon Islands, which does not depend heavily on tourism and is particularly focused more on business travel to some extent rather than holiday travel, their industry, as we can see here from a recent business survey that was conducted earlier this year, has been really impacted. These are the businesses that remained open in 2021 in the tourism sector, and you can see that over 2/3 of them said that they had a reduction in revenue from pre-COVID times of more than 50%. Now, obviously, that doesn't account for those businesses that have already closed. And the ripple impact from those closures and those mothballing processes has been felt everywhere. And this is a quote from one of the businesses in the survey that we ran in the Solomons that just highlighted the role that they play in the broader economy, in the broader community setting within which they operate. As their business slows down, so does the economy of the surrounding communities, so do those opportunities for people to access sources of income and work. It's not only about the impact that tourism has, that COVID has had, it's about the impact that it's going to have in the future as well. This is just a quick example of that. It shows time series data from the same type of business survey that we've been running in the Cook Islands now for 9 phases since 2016. And you can see here, this was just one of the many areas that businesses would talk about when we would ask them how they saw their business evolving over the next 5 years. And you can see that right through to the very last phase, phase 9, we had seen a continued level of confidence among Cook Islands businesses, not just tourism businesses, all businesses, that they were going to continue to see growth over the next 5 years. Phase 9, which we ran towards a similar time actually to now last year, shows just how dramatic the impact was there on business confidence. So that affects investment, it affects planning, it affects everything around tourism development and the opportunities that stem from it. So the impact's dramatic, but I think it's fair to say that we can all see a light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it may seem a little bit more distant or a little fainter, but I think it's in our nature as human beings to look for that light, and I think we are moving closer. For much of the Pacific, this period has been used as a chance to maybe try and rekindle or refocus on domestic tourism. Just like we've seen in New Zealand, it's become a little bit of a champion, a little bit of a cause célèbre. And there's no doubt that that has helped keep the wolf from the door a little bit in some of the destinations that we're talking about. Obviously, bubbles have been a real focus as well. And we've seen recently bubble open and then close in the Cook Islands. That's a model I think that we may see more of in the future, hopefully more open than closed, obviously. Vaccine rollout within the Pacific and also in many source markets has been moving more quickly in some places than others, obviously, but that's a positive sign. But then Delta has come in and added some uncertainty into that mix as well. Certainly overall, global travel projections are looking more positive for 2022 and 23. And I think many parts of the Pacific are hoping to see an opening of borders to some extent in the coming year. But of course, as that light gets closer and we emerge from the tunnel, we then have the question to ask, which path will we follow? Do we follow that old pathway that we had of continued growth, potential over-tourism, perhaps a move towards more unsustainable outcomes and practices? Do we instead take this chance to reimagine, reset, regenerate, think about a new focus for tourism strategies, an emphasis on sustainable tourism, smaller scale, higher value perhaps? Or perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Perhaps we're going to be taking a middle path that will be a bit of a mixture. That's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about now, is which path we're going to take and how we're going to inform, I guess, which path we take and how we measure our journey down that path. And also, I just want to keep everyone aware of the fact, of course, that while COVID has led to radical change and has led to a real shift for tourism and for those who depend on it, it hasn't affected the fact that we have had ongoing processes before and after that are continuing. Climate change, the challenges that all small island developing states face around resource transportation, limited domestic markets, those things are still there. So what COVID has been is a catalyst, I think. It's been a catalyst for us to rethink and to perhaps reset the course that we're going to take as we move forward. And we've been seeing this at a national scale within the Pacific and obviously at the regional scale too, where the SPTO and a number of other regional organisations and bodies have been really looking at ways to think about how the Pacific region is going to move forward. Certainly the SPTO has been very active in working with to develop a sustainable tourism policy framework. There's also been work on tourism statistics being conducted. All of this really bodes well, I think, for the future, and it gives a sense of the seriousness to which this chance to reset has been taken. So where do we go to from here? What does this reset mean? How will we rebuild? What kinds of questions do we need to ask? I'm no soothsayer. I don't have a crystal ball, but I guess just based on my experience and what I've seen to date with our work, these are just some of the ideas that I'd just like to present, really, put out there for discussion. I think it's fair to say also that I have had some of my ideas shaped a little bit by the fact that we are just in the lucky position to be analysing data from visitors that have been to the Cook Islands during the bubble. And I'm not, that data is only just appearing, but what I would say is that it is certainly reinforcing and making us feel quite confident about some of the things that we're talking about here as we move forward. So the first thing I want to talk about is just what's going to happen with those holiday tourists, those tourists that really make up, for most destinations in the Pacific, the bulk of the travellers. And I think what we can see around the world, and I think it is true here in New Zealand too, is that for those people that are travellers, for those people in those socio-demographic groups that do travel and have the opportunity to travel, many of them actually do have extra disposable income. And organisations like the Pew Charitable Trust, for example, in the US, have highlighted that spend on travel is second only to house renovations when it comes to where people want to spend money as they move forward. And I think you can look around many of your neighbourhoods to see the amount of house renovation that's going on to show that, you know, there is this pent-up demand, and I think a lot of that demand is going to be actually moving in towards travel when that becomes more readily available. Traveling, though, requires confidence. It requires a sense of certainty, and I think we're having to look very closely now at how we handle bookings, how we handle cancellation policies, what kinds of policies governments put in place around visitors being insured as well. So there are going to be big questions in that area that have to be looked at. And I think we can see already internationally that there are going to be sectors and segments that are going to be slow to recover. Unfortunately, for Pacific destinations that depend heavily on cruise, such as Vanuatu, we are likely to see this as one of the areas that will recover slowly, more slowly than short-haul air travel, for example. And also just the nature of long-haul travel may create challenges for the region as well, especially given that there are for many long-haul travellers, they're having to transit through a number of different destinations, raising concerns and worries. I think it's also fair to say that we're likely to perhaps see some changes in the type of visitor behaviour and the type of visitor that's coming. And some of the work that's being conducted around the world at the moment and some of the discussions that are being held are that perhaps we're going to see people, as a result of lockdown and working from home, rethinking about work-life balance, seeking deeper travel experiences, perhaps having less tolerance for crowding, health, and safety concerns. But then I look at this image, and I hasten to say that's not from the South Pacific, it's actually from Florida. I look at this image and I start to wonder about whether an old saying is really better applied here, that past behavior predicts future behavior. Perhaps we are going to see at the same time a return to old ways. Not for everyone, but I do believe that, you know, tourism and those bad old days are not gone for good. We have to keep that in mind as we look at how tourism may develop as we move forward. What will the leisure traveller to the Pacific perhaps look like when bubbles open up? And I'm not talking about 5 years' time. I'm really talking about the shorter term here, because I think that is where the focus is most keenly applied just at the moment. These are just a few of my general thoughts. I think we're going to see couples and solo travellers being more significant than in the past. I think we may also see a slightly older visitor profile. That may surprise some because, you know, older people are perhaps more vulnerable to COVID. We need to remember that I think that the Pacific will be seen as a relatively safe place to travel. Older people tend to have been vaccinated earlier. They tend to be less concerned about some of the challenges of working within timeframes and issues that may relate to some uncertainty with travel. And I also believe that some of these travellers are likely to be refocused long haulers. So the visitors that would be travelling to North America or Bali, for example, are thinking of closer to home and are starting to refocus their energies elsewhere when it comes to travel. I think they're likely in the short term to probably be higher income and potentially higher spend visitors than these destinations have seen in the past. And that is what we're starting to see, I think, emerge from some of our early information from the Cook Islands. I also think we're going to see some groups taking a little while longer to bounce back. I think family travel, group travel will take a little longer. I think weddings in particular are going to be a sector that will be slow to bounce back because they do rely on a sense of certainty around travel. They also rely on multiple elements of the tourism industry being open and ready to work. And so that's a factor that we always have to keep in mind here, the reopening of businesses as well. I think length of stay and outer island travel propensity may increase. I think people, when they do travel, are going to try and make the most of it. And I think what we will see is a higher proportion of overall visitors being repeat visitors, what we might call devoted holiday visitors, the equivalents of, say, a Winston Peters going back to Cook Islands on a regular basis. He's a politician in New Zealand, for those of you that don't know, who's famous for his visits to the Cook Islands. But I think also, and this came through from our meeting rooms earlier, a key driver is going to be visiting friends and relatives. Pacifica, people coming back to visit. Also, I guess what we might say, people visiting their expatriate relatives working or consulting in these destinations as well. So VFR will increase in importance. I think we can also say that business travel may have an initial burst of activity, but will then drop back to levels lower than we saw before. I think the questions for the Pacific in this sense are the same as everywhere. How often do we need to have face-to-face meetings? There's no doubt that the Pacific is very much a face-to-face environment, but we have adjusted. And I think with corporate costs and desires to cut carbon footprints, business travel will be one of the areas that will undoubtedly suffer as a result of that. We might ask, why is that important for the Pacific? Well, we need to remember that in the Pacific, the business market is important. Even for destinations that are more holiday oriented, the business traveller is significant. For urban areas, they do spend more money on their, often on because they're on accounts, expenses, etc. They are an important market, and for some destinations like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, they are a substantial market. So it's important we think about the sector and how those changes may influence Pacific destinations in the future. Another key factor that we have to obviously focus on and is very central to these discussions is the environment. I think everyone realizes you can't kill off the goose that lays the golden egg. It's vital that the environmental resources upon which tourism depends in the Pacific are maintained and sustained and perhaps even regenerated in some cases. There's no doubt that we're seeing sustainability becoming increasingly integrated into business practice. I know that there are certainly NTOs around the region that are now creating sustainable development, sustainable management positions within their organizations. We know that environmental concerns are an increasing focus for the visitor or the guest, but also for the host, communities and businesses and governments. There are questions here. Will carbon offset costs and will increasing costs that reflect the desire to create more sustainable outcomes from tourism, will they be a deterrent for travellers? Are travellers going to be willing to pay increased arrival or departure fees to cover some of these dimensions? These will be questions that will emerge, I think, in the coming year or two. Will government and industry really be willing to make a meaningful transition? It'll be very tempting, I think, sometimes to slip back. How can that be ensured? And I think another issue that will be important and which will require a regional focus is to what extent will we see a level playing field emerge? We would be very, I think, in a dangerous position if we started to see some countries undercutting others because they were not perhaps applying some of those costs for visitors to meet relating to meeting more sustainable development outcomes. The environmental dimension is critical, and this is again where I want to just focus on research. I'm just looking here at a slide of an algal bloom in the Muri Lagoon at Rarotonga a few years ago. This is just some data from the Cook Islands IVS, which focuses on visitors' least appealing aspects, what they find least appealing about their visit. You can see here that there are two peaks where the typical sort of 7-8%, I'm sorry, I've lost the axis there. This typical 7-8% of visitors jumps up to 18%, 20%, and then around about 15%. That reflected the impact that this algal bloom was having on the visitor experience. We could tell from the data that these visitors were actually tending to be more repeat visitors as well. So the key thing here is that we want to be able to trace these things over time. We want to be able to understand the visitor perception of these environmental impacts. They can give us a very good sense of how the industry is performing. And in a sense, the visitor can almost become like a citizen scientist in terms of giving their feedback and information. We can also use this kind of data to encourage countries to look at some of their competitors and to see how they are performing in a regional sense. This data pulls on that same source, that visitors complaining about different things being the least satisfying part of their visit. And it just again features the environmental and quality dimension of those comments. And you can see here that some destinations like Yap, Niue, and the Cook Islands, they've managed to deal with that algal bloom issue. They have managed to perform relatively well. You can see other destinations, Solomon Islands, PNG, for example, have got work to do when it comes to visitor feedback on environmental quality. So part of the importance of research is not just understanding what's happening within a country, but also allowing comparison between countries within the region and learning from each other. I think another key feature of what we're going to see emerging here, and which is already emerging, is that we're going to see tourism strategies putting community well-being first, community-centric approaches. This has not always been the case in the past, I think it's fair to say, and it's also fair to say that our knowledge of community awareness or attitudes towards tourism, the impacts of tourism on communities, that's probably our weakest area in terms of research, understanding, and knowledge. This is going to be a particularly important area because tourism, as we know, is a vector for COVID-19. We can't assume that communities are just going to be willing to welcome tourism back with open arms. We need to understand how community feels about reopening. We need to not just be concerned about community concerns, visitor concerns about health and safety. We also obviously need to focus on the community dimension. We need to find ways that we can tie tourism performance more directly to community well-being. We need to be able to understand community needs and aspirations as well. We need to also understand, of course, that community is not homogenous. This is just some data from the Cook Islands, where we have been running community awareness and attitude surveys for the past 4 years. 2 of them run before COVID and 1 post-COVID. This is from the most recent, or when I say post-COVID, during the COVID period, this is the most recent research there. You can see here that, for example, the question being asked, we see that Cook Island Māori are far less likely to feel that visitors should be returning to the Cook Islands at this point. You can see also that it's the non-Cook Island Māori that are more confident or are feeling more willing to have those visitors return. Likewise, when we ask if people feel proud to live in a place that can attract many visitors, it's the non-Cook Island Māori within the Cook Islands that are not only more proud about that dimension, but in particular are more likely to say they directly benefit from tourism. A key measure for tourism has to be, to what extent do community feel they directly benefit from that sector? So with this kind of data that we can analyze over time, we can begin to measure the performance of tourism against some of these variables as well. And we can also look at other dimensions that are critical. Gender, for example, is a very important element to the work that we conduct as part of the Pacific Tourism Data Initiative. And here you can see that overall, when we look across a number of variables, women in the Cook Islands tend to be feeling less positive about tourism's benefits and feeling more acutely some of the negative impacts associated with tourism. So research can help us understand what's happening in a general sense, but can also help us dive down and understand variations, for example, within community settings. So I think it's really fantastic that we've had this opportunity, and that destinations around the Pacific and that the SPTO and other stakeholders have really leapt on this opportunity while we've had a hiatus in visitor numbers to really start to think about the industry in the region, how it was performing, where it was heading to, and whether we want to carry on down that pathway. I think it's fantastic that we've got new strategies emerging at a regional level for tourism and tourism statistics and a number of other things, and also at a national scale, a number of destinations developing and rebuilding and refining strategies, looking at ways that they can benefit more directly from tourism and create an industry that is going to be more in keeping with the sustainable development goals, which underpin national development and national economic activities. But I do think there are some questions we have to ask. There's no question that we are talking the talk, and that's fantastic. I guess the big question is, though, will we walk the walk? Are we going to be able to translate these good ideas and warm feelings into real outcomes? That is the challenge. I feel confident that Pacific Island countries will rebound, that tourism will rebound. It may rebound slowly, it may not rebound to the same level or in the same way that we saw in the past, but that needn't be a bad thing. If we can create more benefit from a smaller number of visitors, if the number of visitors can link more to local economies, more to appropriate ways of creating benefit and economic opportunity for communities, those are positive things. Even if we don't have the same numbers, we can still generate maybe even greater potential outcomes for communities. So we can rebound, I believe. The Pacific Island countries can rebound, but they're going to need to choose that right path and to have a map that everyone can understand and follow. Research and data are essential to allow that to happen. If we're going to draw up that map, then we need to understand where we've come from to know where we're going to. We need to understand what was happening prior to what happened with COVID so that we don't repeat those mistakes. At the same time, we need to be ready now to monitor what happens in the future. We need to make sure that research and research tools and mechanisms are in place. That's a big focus for us at the moment with our work as we continue on for several more years with the PTDI, with the support of MFAT and a number of other organisations around the region. So for us, this is not just about drawing up a map, it's about following where we go on that map, monitoring our performance, monitoring how well the industry meets the needs and desires of the people who need to benefit from it most. I also just want to mention here that this is not just about outsiders coming in to do research. It's absolutely critical that we build in-country capacity to develop research and to run research and to interpret and to disseminate research. So certainly for us as researchers, as part of the PTDI, that is a critical element of what we do. And it has been a major focus for us over the last year as we've had less work to do in some areas of our activities. We've really emphasised the capacity building and continued on with the work that we were doing prior to COVID in that area. So ngā mihi, thank you very much. I may have gone a couple of minutes over. I do apologise for that, but I think I'm reasonably close to my 30-minute mark. I hope you were able to hear that okay and there were not too many problems with internet, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Simon. That was a really brilliant presentation. I think for all of us, no matter where we are in the world right now, will have felt the impacts of the lack of tourism on economies, and obviously the flow-on effect that has to communities and to the well-being of all those, not only people that are directly affected in the tourism industry, but everyone that's obviously connected to that through food or different services. Interesting to see about what changes this crisis has brought upon the South Pacific and New Zealand. You know, reflecting on leisure travel, will we be different? Will we travel differently when you go with your families? Will you do things differently? I know my partner, he's just about to go to the States, and I'm very worried for him, and he's just bought a $100 mask, and I've told him, don't go shopping, don't go anywhere. You'll be doing online shopping and getting it delivered to your uncle's house. So, you know, our behaviour is going to change there. Really interesting as well about the potential for a loss of business travel, and what does that mean for those countries in the South Pacific like the Solomon Islands that might be more dependent on that. How should they plan? And I know that zooming around all the breakout rooms, we're all anxious, I think, to reconnect with our families overseas. And what opportunities does that present the Pacific with the VFR market? But I guess with COVID putting everyone in a bit of dire straits at the moment, it would be easy to forget about the environmental and the community concerns that were really apparent before COVID. And obviously our data and research showed that there was community resistance in New Zealand as well. Data and research has shown that. And obviously environmental concerns that we saw in the Pacific and around the world. So to not return to the old way of doing things while looking positively forward, and the role that insights have from being able to see where we were before COVID, to understand the effects of COVID and the changes, but also to give people that ability to manage tourism, to sort of think, reimagine where you want to go to, but also that role of research to actually roadmap out where, how will we arrive? Have we arrived at the destination? And how can we tweak things to make sure that we're going to get there? So Open the floor to some questions.
Just Ailey, just if I could just reflect on those comments there. Something you did raise a couple of times made me realize I missed one of my key points.
Okay.
You did allude a couple of times to New Zealand. I guess there was just one other thing I wanted to say, which is I've been talking about the Pacific, and we often think about the Pacific Islands as, well, they're a small bunch of countries, and they depend on tourism. We know about them, but we don't often think about what we find in the Pacific actually having a relevance here in New Zealand. And I guess I just want to say something, which is that part of what we do as an institute, and many of my team are involved in this, is also work with regions and destinations around New Zealand. Currently, we're actually working on the destination management plan or supporting that plan for Coromandel. One of the things that strikes me is that the Pacific Islands and working in the small island environment can actually provide a real greenhouse, if you like, in which we can develop new ideas and new approaches. We're forced to think about these interconnections, and we've got the scale in which we can really do some interesting work. And I believe there's going to be a lot of findings and knowledge, as there already are, in things like the blue economy, Ailey, where we are going to find work in the Pacific actually really informing and actually benefiting New Zealand as well, at a regional scale, at a local scale in particular.
Thanks, Simon. I've got some questions in the chat here, and I'm just going to read them as they came in. So the first question is from Sari. Simon, has there been any collective consultation among the South Pacific nations to work together rather than competing against each other when it comes to sustainable tourism initiatives such as carbon offsetting?
That's a great question, Sari, and I can't really speak for as I know everything that's going on at the regional level, but certainly the South Pacific Tourism Organization has been very, very active in bringing different nations together to think about broader issues of sustainability, sustainable frameworks. I think the issue of carbon offset, carbon footprints is a very challenging one, and I think that is going to be one that takes time to work through. I was listening to a very interesting radio show the other day, actually, where the CEO of Unilever was talking about the challenge of actually really trying to label your product accurately in terms of its carbon impact. The challenge of trying to do that for a traveller going to the Pacific is also going to be quite significant. So there's going to be lots of work done there, but I would have to say, Sari, that there really is a very clear and strong focus on taking a regional approach, and that is something also that I think New Zealand MFAT is really pushing and driving as well.
Thank you. And this one's from Gobi. Simon, do you think it is premature for destinations to be using the pause and travel as an opportunity to market and promote, or should they instead be focusing on meeting new preconditions for travel, such as health and safety, while supporting tourism businesses to survive through the current economic storm? In your view, what should be prioritised?
Well, that's a great question, Gobi, and I've actually seen recently, I think, some interesting marketing material that coming out for Timor-Leste from memory. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it is important to try and keep your destination in the mind's eye if possible. But at the same time, I think there's no question that the allocation of resources needs to be shifted. And we can see that in destinations where, for example, marketing spend in long-haul markets in particular has been reduced because there's likely to be an extended period before some of those long-haul travellers will be coming back. And that's been redirected into looking at domestic travel, short-haul markets, or potentially, and I know that this has happened because we've seen it in some of the places we work, those budgets are reallocated to sustainable tourism development initiatives, building back better in terms of product development and planning. So there are a number of different ways that funds can be reallocated, but I think overall you would have to say that it makes a lot of sense at the moment to prioritise or perhaps deprioritise a little bit some of that marketing spend.
Thank you. This one's from Roseanne, and Roseanne, you might have to help me out with the acronym in here, but I'll give it a go. Simon, as tourism slowly rebuilds and perhaps not to the same levels, do you think there is another sector that has the potential to fill the void that tourism used to occupy? DSBM in the Cook Islands, for example, or perhaps even the role for increasing development aid? Thanks again.
Well, look, I think there are a number of questions there. The first thing is, again, I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think there's no question that tourism in every destination in the Pacific is going to be smaller than it was, at least for the short term. And it's probably going to look a little bit different as well. The fact that it is being perhaps reset or reimagined, is changing its nature a little bit, may actually allow some opportunities to increase linkages to other sectors. So it may be through tourism that we can stimulate greater growth and activity in other economic sectors that will help offset perhaps a reduction in numbers, in visitor numbers. As far as sectors growing to replace tourism, that's a challenging one, because I guess you have to ask what kind of sector and what kind of growth are they associated with. I certainly know, again, from meetings that we've been having over recent months, that there are concerns that a gap in tourism opens the door for things like forestry in some destinations. It opens the door for more extractive resource use, which in the long term will simply degrade the resources that tourism depends on as well, so that tourism will have even more difficulty in building back. I think there's no question that donor aid or donor support is going to be important. We've already seen a lot of donor money being spent to look at the reset of tourism, to look at the reimagination of tourism, to think about new approaches to developing the industry. All of that is designed to help support and develop that rebuilding process. So I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't think there's any one sector that stands out, but there are opportunities to link up. And another area that just comes to mind, which has been talked about again with some of our people that we work with, is perhaps looking at things like extending visitor visas, encouraging sort of nomadic workers, maybe looking to build on the opportunities of improved telecommunication links in the region to open up opportunities for distance working in the IT type area, those kinds of things, creative sectors, ways to build internally upon cultural and other dimensions that can be shared with the rest of the world as well. So a very long-winded answer, I'm afraid, but a very important question to which I don't have a simple answer.
John F.
I just had a really good question come through from John F. I don't know if he's able to unmute and ask it. I can ask it, John, if you've got technical difficulties there. Would you like me to ask it?
Yep.
Okay.
I think John's not muted. It's not unmuted, so it might be easier, Ailey, for you.
Unmute, John. Unmute.
Perhaps just ask Ailey. Maybe. Oh, no, there's John.
There he is.
Oh, there he is.
Yeah. My question is more about COVID and vaccines, and it all relates to the redevelopment or the reconstruction of tourism. Is that given the large number of vaccines currently in use around the world, and there are many more being developed, I think at last count there's somewhere up around about 100 that are either on the market, in production, or in research labs, and the varying effectiveness of many of these. What sort of coordination is going on around the Pacific, particularly in relation to tourism, around vaccine policy, vaccine passport policy? I mean, the notion of people being vaxxed is a very simple notion on its own. I think it's going to become much more important about what people have been vaxxed with. Not all vaccines are not the same. We've got at least 5 vaccines being used in Thailand, and we already know that 2 of them are very, very low effectiveness. And everybody who's already had those 2 is now getting a booster shot of Astra or Pfizer. Yeah.
That's a great question, John. Thank you. And it's one I've actually been pondering a little bit as well. One of the things that we're focused on at the moment is actually working with our partners in the region to develop greater insights into how visitors feel about COVID, how they feel about the experience of visiting a country during a bubble. This has been a focus for us in the Cook Islands just recently. And we do know that there are some concerns and uncertainty emerging, not just around vaccines, but also around things like tracing approaches, the kinds of apps you can use to show where you've been and how they work. All of those other things are coming through. In fact, we see that in some of the initial feedback we're getting through our work in this space. I'm personally, I don't want to get into all the politics, etc., but I'm actually very pleased that New Zealand has made the approach of going with one vaccine, Pfizer vaccine. Australia has obviously made that shift more recently as they struggled with some of the challenges with AstraZeneca. I know that in Canada, there have been, just a place that I follow closely, there have been some issues with people not being allowed into certain events because they do not have the right kind of vaccine. And obviously in Canada, just in the last week, we've seen both Quebec and Ontario introduce a domestic vaccine passport, one that allows people to get into concerts or to certain activities in that way. I think we're going to see this whole area developing very quickly. But at the moment, I just think it's not a priority for destinations where the borders are still closed, but it needs to become one very soon. Yes. And there's definitely a need for that regional coordination.
Yes.
And it's not just about what the visitor has, it's what the host country has as well.
Exactly.
So a destination like the Cook Islands has received Pfizer. Other destinations in the Pacific are receiving AstraZeneca. There's a mixture there. So there's some big questions going ahead, I think.
I work in a medical school here with a very large hospital, 1,500 bed hospital. So you can imagine the staffing for that. And they very quickly got everybody double vaxxed. So that was completed about 2 months ago, but they've now gone through and are giving a booster shot of Astra or Pfizer to everyone on the staff who was double vaxxed because Sinovac or Sinopharm that they used has turned out to be so ineffective in developing antibodies.
It's going to be absolutely critical as part of research going forward to understand visitor and community perceptions of vaccination, tracing, all of those things that go along with it. There's always going to be that need to improve performance and learn from the past as well. That's a great question, John. Thank you.
And to coordinate with the health and the tourism agencies about the quality of the vaccine.
Absolutely.
Not just whether people like it or not. Okay.
Thank you so much, John. That's a great question. I think we've got room for one more question, and then I know that some people will need to go. We've got till about 4:15, but people can feel free to hang on after that and have more of a chat. So
I'm certainly happy to hang on for a bit longer, Ailey, if that helps. Yeah.
So any more, I'll throw some questions to the floor if anyone would like to unmute and ask Simon.
Oh, Jane? Jane.
Yes.
Yes, Jane.
Okay.
Following on from the medical question, I wondered whether the increased costs of travel insurance was going to have an impact on some of the international visitors to the Cook Islands. I mean, it might be different for VFRs, they might not be quite so anxious, but I think overseas tourists might want medical evacuation, whereas in the past they might not have been quite so bothered about that. Do you think that's going to be a factor?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned in one of the slides there, Jane, I think this area around cancellation policy, insurance is going to be a big area as we go forward. The Pacific is in a relatively good space, although not entirely, of course. We look at places such as Fiji or French Polynesia, but in general, there hasn't been a large number of COVID cases. People have some level of confidence, I guess, that they're not heading into a place like Ailey was mentioning earlier on, like the US. I think at the moment, what we are seeing is that there's actually there appears to be quite a significant boost in the sort of income and household income of the visitors coming. I think people have got some money up their sleeve to travel. I think they're keen to find ways to use that money to vacation, even if they can't go elsewhere. So I don't think the cost of that insurance should be such an issue, to be honest. Not at this point. Maybe as we start.
I was wondering about, because the costs are higher the older you are.
Yeah.
And those people might be more prone to a bad dose of COVID if they do get it.
All I can say, without going into too much detail, Jane, because it's early point, is that doesn't seem to be what's coming through at the moment from our work. But it could well be an issue. As I said, I think this will be an issue that it will depend very much where you're going to in the Pacific and what the situation is there with COVID as well.
Yeah.
There's no question that uncertainty and worry is going to be part of tourism for the coming time. But at the same time, looking at the way in which tourism flows are building back very quickly in Europe at the moment, in North America, it doesn't seem as though that's enough to put people off.
Okay.
Thanks, Jane, for your great question. I've got a really good question in the chat from Stanley, or Stanley. Is it Stanley? Are you
Stanley.
there?
Stanley,
Yeah,
I think.
Stanley
Yes.
from Bangladesh.
Stanley from Bangladesh.
Yes, he's with
Would you like to unmute and ask your question, Stanley?
yes.
Very much, indeed. Thank you so much, Professor Simon. That was a very, very good presentations. I think I'm looking from different side of the world as someone who is outside the bubble of Pacific at the moment. And then my questions will be traveling to Pacific these days has been another challenge from outside the bubble. So in order to reach countries around Pacific island countries, then we have to either travel through Australia, New Zealand, or maybe through Fiji. So my questions would be, in order to rebuild again the tourism, what would be the strategies from at least these three countries that would consider as the gate to enter these Pacific island countries in order to reopen or restore the tourism areas? I guess my questions would be from the tourism and public health point of view, considering these days some of the countries, they are either choosing risk-taking or risk avoidance. Thank you.
Well, thank you. There's a lot of different themes and issues to look at there. I'm not sure if I'll exactly hit the target when it comes to your question, but I'll cover off a few things that I think are important. As I mentioned before, I don't think we're going to see a rapid flow of long-haul travelers into the region for a little while. I think the focus is definitely going to be on those short-haul bubbles. So, you know, for Vanuatu, is there an opportunity, for example, to open up travel to Queensland or to Australia? For the Cook Islands or Niue, is there that opportunity to build a bubble with New Zealand? So those source markets tend to dominate destinations, although they are less important during low season. So the issue will be building on those short haul markets initially. Then over time, long haul will come back. but it requires more confidence. There are more challenges. There are more things to go wrong if you've got to go through a number of different gateways. Clearly, Fiji is an important gateway. Nandi is a key regional airport. Auckland, Sydney, Brisbane. Fiji has been hard hit, and you know, that is going to have some impact on that gateway travel, no doubt. We have seen, for example, in the Cook Islands, certain examples of visitors going to the Cook Islands who have come from other countries other than New Zealand, but have spent time in New Zealand and quarantined here and done whatever they have to do, and then have been able to carry on. So that's probably the one message I would pass on. The other one, I guess, is yes, another thing about long haul travel is to what extent the host community is willing to accept those travelers. Again, I think for much of the Pacific, they do have a buffer in that people have to go through New Zealand or Australia first. But I think that's another thing we have to think about. It's, in fact, those are questions we have asked in our community surveys in the Cooks, which are, you know, how long would you like before visitors come back? Which type of visitors would you like to have come first? Not only that, but do you want the visitors to only come perhaps to your main island and not go to the Pa Inua in the Cooks, or to the outer islands or the outer provinces of Solomons or Vanuatu? There's a series of questions there. I think what we can say overall is that for the time being, the focus is going to be very much short haul for the Pacific destinations.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Dan. Thanks for that question. That leads on us really well to Patsy's question, which she asked in the chat about community wellbeing needs to be determined by communities, and you just talked about the Cook Islands there, and what conditions under which communities would welcome tourists back. And she asks about, do you think this should also include vaccine efficacy or efficiency? Efficacy,
yeah, sure.
I think.
Yeah, I think just to the first point, I think it's absolutely vital that any work that looks at community well-being is work that is co-developed and is incorporating what community wants. That's absolutely critical. So a lot of research that needs to be done is actually just looking at that very question, and then looking to develop suitable indicators and to understand what's important as we go forward. There's no question that there need to be questions, There are questions that have to be asked for sure around community willingness to open up to travel. It's a double-edged sword. Community understands very clearly, if I just look at the Cook Islands again, community understands very clearly that tourism is absolutely vital to the economy and to their livelihoods, but at the same time, they know that it can be a vector for this disease. So there's a balancing act. Cook Islands opened up relatively early to the bubble. Other destinations are certainly looking to wait until they have very, very high levels of vaccination within their own countries before they open up. There are certainly, no doubt, as we heard earlier, there are going to be questions around vaccine efficacy. We may well, even with a Pfizer, we may well say, oh, well, we've had our 2 doses, but maybe in 6 months' time, the question is going to be, well, not are you fully vaccinated, but have you had your booster? And also, of course, we know that Delta isn't going to be the last letter in the Greek alphabet that's going to be used to denote new variants, unfortunately. So there's going to be a changing situation all the time. I think it's going to be a challenging one, and there's going to be some mistakes made along the way, hopefully nothing too major. We're going to need to learn from those mistakes quickly. Community, I just want to reinforce that community willingness to be part of tourism, community willingness to open up to tourism is absolutely central as we move forward. And it has been interesting for us in the work we've done over the years that MPI has been quite interested in New Zealand to understand, that's a Ministry of Primary Industries, to understand some of this information too. As borders open up, they want to know more about what visitors bring with them and take away, and they also want to know more about, again, community feelings about goods and produce that move between countries as well, and we've been able to inform that. So it cuts across so many different things, and it's a very complex area.
Thanks, Simon. I think we've got one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Can I ask question?
You sure can.
Yes. Simon, when I look at your one of your charts, it was looking into the proportion of the people and the visitors. And there are 3 countries that come to my mind was Niue, 1 to 10, Cook Islands 1 to 12.5, and Fiji 1 to nearly 1 to 1. So in that sense, I think I have 2 questions here. So first, I would see that the population is becoming a small, important. I mean, the people there compared to the people who are visiting. So
yeah, so that's just it's a very crude way of just thinking about what we might call over tourism.
Yeah.
You know, you look at New Zealand, for example, and you can see in that figure way back a few years ago, it was, I think, 0.7 to 1.
Yeah.
And obviously it grew beyond that by 2019, but we know that within our country, a destination like Queenstown, for example, or Wanaka has far greater pressure of visitor compared to their local population than even a city like Auckland. So the bottom line is, this was just a way to show that, one, there is a real variation in the size and type and nature of tourism around the region, and that one measure that we can think about is this ratio. How high can that ratio grow before you're reaching that tipping point, before your carrying capacity is exceeded?
Exactly. And the other question is that then how that big number of visitors can be a positive point in a way in putting pressure for changes for the community well-being, for building community resilience, or addressing, for example, like in Indonesia, you know, there was an NGO that working with tourism, sustainable tourism, but they're also trying to build the economy or education. So this is addressing like different points of sustainable development goals, like universal education, you know, involving community to reduce the emerging or re-emerging diseases, like when you mentioned about critical science.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also like malaria, you know, basically if there's any policy for people working and the people and the family working in tourism industries, looking into that kind of policy, that would be really good. I mean, the connection of public health and health promotion.
Well, I think all of these things tie very much into that sense of community well-being, that sense of needing to understand the degree to which tourism really actually works for communities. So that can be about income, it can be about employment, it can be about the ability to link to other community economic sectors like agriculture or handicrafts. It can be about the degree to which women in the community benefit, or the elderly, or the young. You know, there are these different dimensions we have to think about. Certainly, I think areas of health, areas of spirituality, areas of discussions of how community feel about intergenerational dimensions as well of tourism. Those are all things that we need to be thinking about and factoring in as we move forward. A big issue has to be, how do we develop indicators through community input that can act as tools to help us understand tourism performance, in the same way that E. coli measurements in water, or information on visitor spend patterns can also be used. The challenge is finding measures that are robust enough, cost effective enough, and simple enough to really be used over time, and to actually, if possible, to be managed and run through communities. So communities themselves are able to monitor how tourism performs and changes over time. And as researchers, although we may originally play a role to set those things up, how can we ensure that communities have the ability to carry on doing that themselves? So that would be my rather long-winded answer to your question there, Sari. I hope that touches on what you were looking for.
Thank you, Simon. It's very insightful. Yeah, that's correct. So it's really good to be able to interlink and see the connection. Really,
well, I guess that's where the bridge comes in, isn't it?
That's right.
Well done.
Thank you.
And on that note, we do have some more questions in the chat, but what I'll do is maybe the questions that haven't been answered, we'll send an email out with just those remaining questions, because I'll be able to grab them, and I'll give it over to Sari to wrap us up.
Yeah, that would be great. What I would say is, if I can, I haven't really had a chance to look at the chat, but I will do, and I'm a bit of a dinosaur technologically, but any questions, I'll be very happy to try and respond by email, or if it's someone that I know or can contact, I can chat by Zoom or other things as well.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for joining us. We will keep you posted with the next seminar. If you have any topic that you want to discuss, or you have any potential speaker you want to share with us, you can contact me or contact Ailey. Stay well, stay safe, and I will say ngami hinui, malo, fafate, lafa, and thank you to all.